Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scylla's Polecats, or welcome to Scylla's Polecats, and welcome back to another update on the Reading Around the World Challenge. The third one this year so far, and to this date, the best one I've done. Because I have actually finished, hold up, 8 entire books for the Reading Around the World Challenge in March. So I'm going to have to try and keep this as brief as possible. That's gonna be great. Alright, so, honestly, I think I did this the last time as well, and I'm gonna do it this time again because these books are so incredibly different and it's really hard for me to, rank them in any particular order. So let's just go for alphabetical order again. Alphabetical order from where exactly these books are coming from. So the first one that we get to talk about, which is funnily enough actually the first one I also finished in that month, which might or might not be because it's really short. But the first one we're going to be talking about is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman for Belgium. This book was translated from French by Ross Schwartz, and it was written, because it's actually a little bit older as well, it was written in 1995 with the English translation copyright from 1997. This is a relatively short, I think it's like 100 and, yeah, it's under 200 pages, it's 180 pages roundabout, and it's a very short dystopian fiction book about a young girl who grows up with a bunch of women in a cell, essentially, in a basement, with no knowledge of how she came there, how any of them came to be there, really. All of them seem to suffer, like, a communal bout of amnesia, really, about what happened to them. And the only men that she sees are the people keeping watch over them. She doesn't interact with them, she doesn't talk with them, she doesn't know why she's there, she doesn't know why the men are there, nothing makes sense. Until at some point, all hell breaks loose, essentially, and she, as well as the other 39 women, because they are 40 women in total, break out of the facility that they have been kept in and come to the surface of an unknown world they know nothing about, and they still don't know what happened. But now they are free, whatever that means. The book was incredibly interesting to me because it's very much not about her finding anything out about her situation. If you're reading this book because you want to know what happened, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Sorry to say that. That's just how this book works. I Who Have Never Known Men is not about finding out what exactly happened to these women. It's about the fact that they never can find out, and so what they try to find is peace with the entire situation of never being able to know what exactly happened to them and for what reason. It's a very calm book in a way, and it very much, in my opinion, talks about how a certain ways of acting and interacting with other people are definitely learned mechanisms and not innately born abilities that we have, which is very obvious since a lot of these women come from the perspective of having lived in a quote-unquote normal world before being thrust into whatever this is, whereas our main character and our narrator, who narrates everything from a first-person perspective, doesn't know anything about the world that she came from, and so naturally adapts to different circumstances a lot faster and very different than the other women in the group. Another very interesting thing is that she never truly gets to have a name, because all the other women did grow up with their names already attached to them, whereas she was basically just named the girl, or you, by all of these women. And given that the book is told in first-person perspective, we as the reader also never really get to hear her have any name, which I personally found to be a very interesting choice to make. So overall, I had a very good time with I Who Have Never Known Men. I definitely recommend this for people who are into this dystopian exploration of people's adaptation to different lives and different worlds that they don't really know what to do with. I don't recommend this for people who want action, because there's none, or basically none, in this book. The most they do is wander around, so don't get it for that. And also, if you are frustrated by books that don't explain themselves to you, I would not recommend this one either, because as I said, it's very much about the fact that these women know nothing about what's happening around them, and it just keeps going like this. It's not changing. It's never going to change. You're never going to know what exactly happened to them and why, because they will never know. And I found that very interesting, but I do understand that some people are not necessarily the biggest fans of that, which is entirely fair. So, I do recommend this book, though, because it was really good. I personally enjoyed it, that is. So that was my pick for Belgium. And the next one is one that I actually read digitally, because my library thankfully got a copy for it, because it is currently too expensive for me to buy, I won't lie. And that was Womb City by Tloto Tsamase for Botswana. This book, it was pitched as something like reminiscent of The Handmaid's Tale, and I would say that to a certain extent it's definitely that, because Womb City is set in Botswana, and it's basically this dystopian. We had a lot of like dystopian-esque fiction in March, just don't worry about that, but it's basically this dystopian world where a lot of people get microchipped, and with a lot of people I mean predominantly women, because everyone who gets microchipped is someone who is destined, I would say, or in danger of committing a crime. And if you are microchipped, of course you cannot commit that crime against your citizens or fellow citizens without being heavily and severely punished, right? So, the world is safe, except it is under constant surveillance, and a lot of people are treated like shit. So, kind of like right now, except we're also not safe. But hey, we're getting there. And our main character is a woman who has so far also body hopped a lot, because that's also something people can do. They can basically leave their own bodies, their old bodies behind, and then inhabit a new body, but they will also consistently forget anything and everything that happened to them in their previous lifetimes. At least that's something that they are told. And this also happened to our main character, because she has been body hopping. This is her third body, if I remember that correctly, and she does not remember anything from her previous bodies. She is also microchipped, and so she is constantly in a state of severe paranoia. Justified, but still. And she is trying to get pregnant because, as a woman in that society, it is her duty to become pregnant, which also is supposed to help her husband's status. Because of course we had to add that into the mix too. The book is incredibly bleak and incredibly brutal, because at some point the general idea of this like surveillance state that we talk about, specifically when it comes to the rights of women and also the rights of queer people, because this book also talks a lot about queerness in a way, in my opinion. Like, even though the book itself, or the main couple itself, might not seem entirely queer, the main character, even though she is in the body of a woman and does feel like a connection to womanhood, definitely also reads, in my opinion at least, very genderqueer in a way. And there's a lot of discussions about what happens to people who feel genderqueer, who want to hop between bodies of different genders, for example. And while that is definitely something that is, to the end of the book, very much important, there is an almost abrupt cut, like right in the middle of it, and we go from a dystopian exploration of motherhood and oppression of women to some of the most intense horror scenes I did not expect. It was fantastic. I have to say, I did not read the back of the book because I wanted to be surprised, and also a friend of mine, Sarah, she's back, whom I do trust when it comes to like book recommendations, told me that I was going to enjoy this book, and so I was like, I'm gonna trust you. Also, I didn't pay for this. I got this from the library, so at this point it's fine. I did not read the back of it because the back does kind of tell you where this is going, and so the very first thing that happened took me so much by surprise. I was hooked immediately. Like, I was hooked before that. I really enjoyed the first part of the book where we basically get this build-up of, like, how the society looks like and how it treats its women horribly. But that cut was so intense. It was so good. I highly recommend this book. I will say it's very brutal. It's very gruesome. There's a lot of blood. There's body horror, at least to a certain level, I would argue. be prepared about that when you go into this book. Just be prepared, okay? That's all I'm saying. It's a lot. It's fantastic. I personally loved this book. I was so intrigued by it. I'm definitely going to get a physical copy because I want to annotate it, because there was some moments I didn't understand anything of. And I would like to, on a second read. Wow. I highly recommend this book. It's great. It's fantastic. So, that's honestly all I can say about this. Moving on! So the next one, if I can do my alphabet, which, honestly, I'm trying, guys, okay? But the next one is for France, and that is The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Mass. Now, this is also a translation from French, translated by Frank Wynne, whom I actually know from poetry, I think. And the original title was Le Bal des Folles, which basically translates to the exact same thing. It's, not necessarily the Mad Women's Ball, but it's the Mad Person's Ball, and the person is specifically female, because that's how gendered languages work. But anyway, The Mad Women's Ball is a historical fiction about the asylum, the Salpêtrière Asylum, and it is set in 1885. And the Salpêtrière Asylum, apparently, which is a real place that actually existed, was supposed to basically, yeah, lock women away. The ones that did not behave properly, the ones that did not do things as they were told, the ones who caused a fuss in whichever way, shape, or form for whichever male character in their life. And we mostly follow the journey of two specific people, one of whom, her name is Geneviève. She's a senior nurse at the Salpêtrière, and so she is responsible for the women there in the ward, and has always looked after them, essentially. And the other one is a new person, or new woman, who is coming into this place, lovely place. Her name is Eugenie, and she's being brought into there by her father because she claims that she can see dead people and communicate with them to a certain extent. Which, of course, prompts her father to lock her away, because that's what you do. And so you basically follow this journey from two different sides, because Eugenie, of course, wants to escape the Salpêtrière, and Geneviève, at least for the most part, is convinced that what she's doing is good work. She's working for the doctors who say that they are going to cure these women, they're going to cure them of the things that plague them, including but not limited to, like, bodily shakes, and almost epileptic episodes, I would say. Of course, female mass hysteria, that's always a big one in books like these, isn't it? And I actually really enjoyed this. The book is also not that long. It's like just over 200 pages, so you know, you can always glide through it fairly easily. And I personally really enjoyed how a lot of the things that were talked about in this book specifically also went in the direction of, yes, of course, it was horrific to lock these women up like that, and there were also medical procedures being done onto them and so on and so forth that were definitely not good TM, but to a certain extent, what places like the Salpêtrière also gave these women was a place where they could, at very least, have some company from like-minded people, in this case like-minded women, and to a certain extent, some women who got put into these places never wanted to leave, because sadly enough, they felt like this was the one place where they could essentially exhibit their traits without someone inherently judging them. The entire premise of this book, by the way, which is why it's called The Mad Women's Ball, is that apparently the Salpêtrière hosted a ball of these mad women, where normal people from outside got to see them dressed up as if for a normal ball, you know, taking place in society. And there's a lot of instances where during the actual ball, because obviously it does take place at some point in the book, during the actual ball, there's a lot of instances where the author basically goes, yeah, so the women from the Salpêtrière, they are behaving normally. They're just dancing, they're having fun, they're socializing. The people from outside, the ones who keep pointing at them, at the women, the mad women, the ones who keep laughing at them, those seem the mad ones. And there's a lot of these talks about how society treated people who were different. And I mean, to a certain extent, definitely still treats, but to go into a book that is set in 1885 is obviously to accept that some things are going to be way worse than they are right now, because at least we're not still diagnosing all women with mass hysteria, especially the ones to whom force has been done to, which is also something that the book definitely talks about. So in case you want to read this, there's a lot of trigger warnings regarding the treatment of the disabled, the treatment of the mentally ill, treatment of women in general. There is rape and the allusion to rape, the recounting of rape, and a lot of these specifically violent things that have been done and continue being done to women, but in the like idea of these women then being put into a mental asylum because they are deemed the ones who've lost their minds instead of the people who did violence onto them. So it's a heavy book, but I personally did enjoy my time with it because I personally thought that the author did a great job with it and everything that came with it. And I will not lie, the cover is gorgeous. Look at that. She's so pretty. So that was Friends. Next, what's the next one? Can I do my alphabet? Probably not. No, I can. The next one is for Idak, and we have Frankenstein in Baghdad by Amit Sadoui. So this book was translated from Arabic by Jonathan Wright, and it's also a relatively recent book, and it is a retelling, or not necessarily retelling perhaps, but it's a reimagining of the story of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, but set in Baghdad, as the title suggests. And basically what happens is there's a lot of bombings going on, American bombs, but also suicide bombers who try to protest against certain moves of the government currently present in Iraq. And Hadi, who is basically someone who starts collecting junk and then resells it, Hadi started collecting body parts of people who have been implemented by these bombs, and he collects these and he starts sewing them together because he wants to create one entire body that he can essentially present to the police enforcement at this place and claim them as one collective victim who is deserving of a burial. Because of course there's this very horrific thing that if you get blown up by a bomb, there's not a lot of you left to bury anywhere. So yikes. And so that's essentially his goal. He wants to create a body that he can then, to a certain extent, treat like a human being and then bury accordingly. However, the body that he sews together, because this is a Frankenstein retelling, comes to life because he's inhabited by the soul of someone else who also died at one of those bombings a few days previously. And he gets up and he starts walking around and he starts exacting revenge upon the people who harmed those whose body parts he carries. The entire book is told from a multitude of different perspectives. Like, there's different chapters essentially that have different names. Like the first one is, for example, the Mad Woman, the second one is the Liar, we have Uzo and the Bloody Mary, we have the Body, which obviously is from the perspective of whoever was, you know, not reincarnated, but put into this body that's now walking around. And I found this book so incredibly fascinating. As you know, because I've said this multiple times, I wrote my bachelor's thesis on Frankenstein, and so Frankenstein has become kind of like my personality, and so every single time I see a Frankenstein retelling, I legally have to read it, and I'm so glad I picked up this one. It goes into so many details about stuff like, who even is a bad person, and how can we say that someone is a bad person when every single one of us has done bad deeds, and where does the cycle of violence end? But there's also this very detached idea of not even being able to access your perpetrators or the people who have done harm onto you because they are so far removed from you that it is utterly impossible for you to do anything about that. There's also the idea that since every single character in this book is, to a certain extent, a witness of something, a lot of these witness memories blur together, and you're completely unable, to a certain extent, to get a full picture of what exactly is going on, which struck a chord with me specifically because the one thing that I specifically talked about when it came to Frankenstein was the unreliability of its narrators, and Frankenstein in Baghdad is essentially the same thing. Every single narrator that we have, to a certain extent, is going to be unreliable, either because they don't have the full picture of information. At some point we follow a journalist as well who very, very specifically says that he took the words, the body, or the what's-its-name, as the monster is called, the, you know, sewn together body parts are called. There's a part where the journalist very specifically says that he received words from the what's-its-name, and heard what the what's-its-name is trying to do, and still changed some of the words to make them sound a bit more dramatic when he was writing his article about it. And so there's a very obvious point of someone being an unreliable narrator to other people, because the way that he is giving them the information is heavily influenced by what he is or is not allowed to publish in the magazine that he works at. So this was such a great pick. I'm so happy that I found this book. I was thrilled to dive into this, and I personally cannot recommend Frankenstein in Baghdad enough, especially if you already like Frankenstein. Like, just get it. It's fantastic, it's great, it's wonderful, very gruesome, very brutal, very sad in a detached way, almost. I loved it. 10 out of 10. A fantastic book. Next one. I got it. Next one is for Malaysia, and the one that I chose for this is Tales of the Celestial Kingdom by Sue Lin Tan, which is a companion novel, short story collection to the Celestial Kingdom duology. I love that duology to pieces, and it's basically about the daughter of the moon goddess who goes onto a quest to clear her mother's name so her mother does not have to be imprisoned on the moon any longer. The entire duology is first-person perspective, only from Xin Jing, who is our main character, Xing Yin, right? Hold up. Oh, God. Xing Yin, I'm sorry. Her name is Xing Yin, and she is basically on this quest to help her mother no longer be imprisoned on the moon. And the entire duology is only told from her perspective in first-person perspective, whereas this collection of short stories has short stories from various different characters, telling or retelling some of the moments that actually also happened in the novels themselves, but from a very different perspective and a different angle. And I'm a huge fan of that, because I think when an author writes short stories for something, I want them to give me something special, but not necessarily something that I need in order to fully understand what happened in the original books, if that makes sense. So I'm always a huge fan of authors just taking specific scenes that already happened in the books and then just retelling them from a different perspective. Chef's kiss. Thank you for this gift, Sue Lin Tan. I had such a fun time. I highly recommend you read the 2 books before you get to this one, though, because you will get spoilers. Specifically for the end of the 2nd book as well. Don't do that to yourselves. Read this one when you've gotten to the entire duology, and I hope that you have a great time with it, because it is a fantastic duology, wonderful reimagining of the legend of the moon goddess Chang'e, in this case from her daughter's perspective. So it's a fantastic series. I highly recommend it. It's so much fun to read. So this is your sign to pick it up. Also, the covers, every single cover is this beautiful. So, there you go. Next one, this is also still with the letter M, and that is for Mexico. And what I read was Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is my 3rd book that I'm reading by this author. The first one was Mexican Gothic, the second one was Certain Dark Things, and now we have Velvet Was the Night. And here's the funny thing. I was not the biggest fan of Certain Dark Things. I thought, okay, maybe this author isn't for me. I don't know what exactly is going on, but I'm not enjoying myself overly much. I felt her writing style to be very dry and repetitive, and I wasn't the biggest fan of how she presented information to me in a fantasy world. Maybe I just need to read her stuff that's not fantasy, because this is a noir historical novel set in 1970s Mexico, and I loved it. I was so invested in the characters. I was so invested in everything that was going on. If you read one Silvia Moreno Garcia book, apparently I need to recommend this one to you because it was fantastic. Now, caveat, I will say that maybe I could have gotten more out of this book if I had Googled the historical events that actually went on there, because I'm not the super biggest history nerd, and I don't know a lot about Mexico, but I especially don't know a lot about 1970s Mexico, so maybe some of the things might have been a bit more impactful if I'd known more about the history of Mexico, but I will say that Silvia Moreno Garcia managed to give me information about the political situation, so I could at least follow some of what was going on without feeling like completely and utterly lost. So I did very much enjoy that. And the story is told from two perspectives. So first we have Elvis, who's part of a street thug gang called the Hawks. And the other one is Maite, who is a 30-something law firm secretary, and they both begin the story by starting to look for a lost woman who happens to be Maite's neighbor, because Maite is taking care of her cat, and then notices that, you know, she's just not returning, which very much annoys Maite because she doesn't want to keep taking care of this goddamn cat. And Elvis is looking for, what's her name again? Leonora. Elvis is looking for Leonora because she is apparently in the possession of some photographs that are politically a little bit dicey, and he needs to have them for his boss, who very specifically tells him that he's supposed to find Leonora and the pictures by any means necessary. It's very dark. It's very much diving into political, political corruption, student movements that get brutally knocked down. Everyone is suspected to be a communist for some reason. We hate the communists in this one, apparently. We hate the communists and the Americans because we have enough hate to go around everywhere. And it very much also delves into, like, the aspects of fascism that a lot of people don't want to talk about because it gets very dark and very dirty and very messy. And I personally really enjoyed this book. I also really enjoyed the main characters, actually, because they were so incredibly flawed. And especially Maite sometimes read a little bit naive, which in my opinion was entirely intentional because the author really wanted to hammer down how much the everyday person is easily manipulated and influenced by how the politics around them work and operate. Just by, you know, keeping them in line. You know, if you just read the normal newspaper, you're never going to know what exactly is going on. You're never going to know how much the people actually suffer in the shadows, because you don't bother to look. You're scared. You don't want to. And I personally think that Maite was the perfect protagonist to kind of explore that a bit more in, because she's not necessarily a good person. She's just a person. She's just a woman living in the city trying to make ends meet. And she gets dragged into this entire thing, and suddenly she's essentially forced to open her eyes to some of the corruption that's happening in New Mexico. And it's honestly kind of heartbreaking to have to read that, and realize and also know that a lot of this was based on historical events that actually took place, especially some very brutally knocked down uprisings and student movements and so on and so forth. It's always the student movements. They're always suffering, no matter in what country you are. So, yeah, this was the best Silvia Moreno Garcia I've read so far, honestly. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I recommend this one. If you read any Silvia Moreno Garcia book, apparently it's supposed to be this one, so there you go. I have two more left, and one of them is, another library book that I actually listened an audiobook to, and that was Paradise Rot by Jenny Wahl, which is a Norwegian book. I forgot, unfortunately, who translated it, so I'm going to look that up and put it down in the description box below. But Paradise Rot is a short, queer horror novella, essentially. I think the audiobook was like 3-ish hours, so that's like 150 pages maybe. And it was incredibly fascinating. It's about this Norwegian student who moves to, I believe it's England, and she has to find a roommate with whom to, you know, share a room or something because she doesn't have accommodations yet. And the person she finds is living in an abandoned warehouse or I think it was a warehouse, if I remember that correctly. And that's where things get weird. And the thing about Paradise Rot is it doesn't really have a plot. What I just told you is essentially it. But the thing that Paradise Rot has is this exploration of being a foreigner in a place where you don't feel at home, and how that in and of itself, as well as your surroundings and the people that you start talking with, warps your sense of self until you're not entirely sure anymore who you are and what you're talking about and what's going on. And the way that Jenny Val went about this was so incredibly interesting and also incredibly relatable to me as a person. Like how the main character at some point, for example, says that just to speak her name makes it feel different, because the way that she has to say it for an English audience is very different than how she would say it in Norwegian, and so that alone seems to change her sense of self. The book then goes on to delve into weird horror-esque scenarios, like for example there's mushrooms growing in the entire house. No one exactly knows what's going on, and the thing that I want you to know when going into this book is it's about the vibes. It's the horror vibes. There's not a lot of plot. There's not that many explorations of various different themes, except for, you know, as I said, this sense of strangeness, both in country as well as in sexuality, honestly. And it's just weird. In the best sense possible. I love this book. I gave it 5 stars, but it's weird and it's very delicious. So I highly recommend it for that alone. And last but not least, and let's hope that my camera does not die on me here, we have my nomination for the Philippines, and that would be The Sleepless by Victor Manibo. This is a standalone sci-fi-esque, not necessarily horror-esque, but kind of like that dystopian exploration. We had a lot of dystopian this month. Standalone, set in a future where people have been struck by a plague that renders them sleepless. Not all of them, mind you, but a very large proportion of people. And so, in order to fully capitalize, on these sleepless people, the world has essentially become a much faster and even more dehumanizing environment, really, because the sleepless don't need sleep, and so they can just pick up another shift, or 2, or 3, every single day, because the capitalist machine has to keep on running. Isn't that great? We follow our main character, whose name is Jamie, and he is a journalist who at some point, he is also sleepless, of course, and he comes into work at one day and he notices that his boss is dead. And where everyone suspects a suicide, because that's how it looks like, especially because his boss is holding like an empty pill bottle in his hand, and so people obviously assume that he overdosed on something. Where everyone assumes suicide, Jamie immediately jumps to the conclusion that this was murder, and so now he is trying to find out what exactly happened. That is the premise of The Sleepless, and it is, to a certain extent, definitely what it mostly talks about. Like, a lot of the things that Jamie does are things he explicitly starts doing because of what happened to his boss. But there's also a lot of exploration going on about the Sleepless themselves, what happened with them. What I found very interesting about this book in particular is the main character is also queer. I don't think it's ever fully said, what kind of sexuality label he has. I think he's bisexual, because I think he had something with women as well, but he predominantly has relationships with men in the book. And The Sleepless does not discriminate against queer people. Like, the book itself does not discriminate against queer people, but the Sleepless themselves experience discrimination on a specific level. There used to be hate crimes against them. People were so incredibly afraid of also catching this disease, of which no one really knows how exactly it got transmitted, and so they were shunned. And only after people realized how quote-unquote useful they could be for capitalism, there is so many layers in this. Only after that did the Sleepless gain some sort of, like, better status, I would say. And what I found so interesting is that Victor Manibo, who is a queer author himself, in my opinion, mirrored some of the talking points that people have when they discriminate against queer people to talk about the sleepless. I very distinctly remember a moment where someone said that being sleepless was to basically be against God, because that's not how God made you, because God made you as a person who needs sleep. And that is a statement a lot of queer people have heard throughout their entire life, because it's supposed to be a man and a woman, and they're supposed to have children together because that's how God made you. And I found it very interesting how Victor Manibo chose to not have queer discrimination in his book, but then explored that idea of discrimination against someone's specific nature by giving that to the sleepless themselves. I found that very interesting, personally. It's very obvious that there is still some sort of difference there, of course, because while, of course, the sleepless also can't do anything about that, like queer people can't, it's not the same to discriminate against someone who can't sleep as opposed to someone who's queer. So, especially since this whole sleepless thing started as a pandemic, and so it's understandable to a certain degree that people are concerned about this. So, it's not a one-on-one switch, and I'm pretty sure that that was also definitely not what Victor Manibo was going for, but there are some vibes there that I personally found very interesting. There's also a lot happening throughout the book that isn't necessarily just Jamie trying to find out what exactly happened with his boss. But as I said, that's kind of like the red thread that leads you to this through the story, is Jamie trying to find out what exactly happened, because he is a journalist, goddammit, and he's going to find out who exactly did that to his boss and why, which might or might not be the more prescient and also more difficult to answer question. I personally really loved The Sleepless. I do highly recommend it. I thought it was really interesting. And while the thing is, I don't necessarily think that it's like super hard to guess some of the plot twists, I would say, that this book goes through, but I really enjoyed how it talked about specific things, such as, for example, trying to fix the world as only one person, and how utterly impossible that is, actually, and how important it then is to have people on your side that can support you to a certain degree. Which seems like a weird thing to, you know, appear in a book, in a noir, sci-fi, dystopian book that is about a guy who might or might not have killed himself, but that is where we go. Which is something that, as I said, I personally really enjoyed about The Sleepless, so I do also highly recommend this book in particular, if any of what I just said sounded interesting to you. And that is actually the last book of the 8 books that I read in total in March for my Reading Around the World challenge. I had a fantastic time. We went a lot darker this month than I think we did the previous months, which was a little bit surprising to me, but alas, here we are. I honestly highly recommend every single one of these books. I don't think I had a single one where I was like, that was okay. I think with every single one of these books, I was like, yeah, something about this, at least one aspect was something that really intrigued me. So, yeah, let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books, or if you now feel the need to pick any of them up, and also why, because I'm always interested in that. And do also feel free to let me know if you're also doing the Reading Around the World challenge, and if so, how far have you gotten? How many books have you already read from various countries in the world? And how much did you enjoy the challenge of maybe finding books from countries you might or might not even have heard about? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself, and you continue having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.